Before British rule, India was a highly prosperous, self-reliant agricultural society. Farmers grew enough food to comfortably sustain their communities, and the subcontinent held a massive share of global wealth. Beyond farming, Indian artisans commanded a worldwide market. Their hand-woven silk, cotton textiles, and precious stonework were highly sought after for their precise craftsmanship. That economic balance shifted in 1757. After winning the Battle of Plassey, the British East India Company began transitioning from a trading partner into a governing power. The company looked at India's massive population and deep natural resources and saw an opportunity to fuel their own industrial ambitions back in Britain. They engineered India to function strictly as a feeder economy. The setup was simple. Cheap raw materials were shipped directly to British factories, and the resulting machine-made finished goods were sold right back to the Indian market. Achieving this level of systematic exploitation required the construction of a massive, three-stage extraction pipeline designed to drain the subcontinent's wealth. The first stage of that pipeline started at the source, the land itself. The colonial government introduced a new land administration policy known as the zamindari system. Under this system, local landlords, or zamindars, were required to pay a strict fixed rent to the British. To meet those steep payments, landlords squeezed the tenant farmers who actually worked the soil, taking almost everything they grew. The British also pushed farmers away from growing sustainable food crops like wheat and rice. Instead, laborers were forced to cultivate cash crops like cotton, jute, and indigo, the raw materials British factories desperately needed. Because the landlords only cared about collecting their rent, and the British only cared about acquiring raw materials, no one put any money back into the land. There were no investments in modern technology, fertilizers, or basic flood control. The soil slowly lost its fertility, and agricultural yields plummeted. This deliberate neglect left the 85% of the population living in rural villages trapped in extreme poverty, just to keep the British supply lines full. With the raw materials secured, the second stage of the pipeline was making sure Indian artisans couldn't use those materials to manufacture competing products. The British implemented heavily biased tax policies. They allowed raw materials to leave India tax-free and British finished goods to enter tax-free. But if an Indian artisan tried to export their handmade textiles, they faced massive tariffs, making their goods too expensive to compete. This chart illustrates the missing link in India's economy: capital goods industries. These are the factories that build heavy machinery, like tractors or industrial looms, which are necessary to process raw goods on a large scale. The colonial administration actively avoided developing these industries in India. Without machines to process their own resources, Indian laborers had no choice but to rely on British industrial hubs to do the manufacturing. The lack of local factories was a calculated policy of industrial sabotage, specifically designed to ensure India remained locked into a state of industrial dependency. The final stage of this system required a highly efficient valve to quickly pump those raw materials out and flood the market with finished products. That valve opened in 1869 with the completion of the Suez Canal. By cutting straight through Egypt, British ships no longer had to navigate all the way around the continent of Africa. This direct route gave Britain such a massive shipping advantage that they monopolized over half of India's total foreign trade. As this data shows, India was technically running a massive trade surplus, exporting far more than it imported. But that wealth never reached the domestic economy. The British administration siphoned off the surplus to pay for their own colonial offices and to fund external wars. Rather than enriching the subcontinent, international trade functioned as a one-way funnel, bleeding India's wealth dry. By the time India achieved independence in 1947, nearly 2 centuries of this extractive system had left the nation heavily scarred. The demographic data reveals the human cost. Average life expectancy had plummeted to just 32 years, and the literacy rate sat at a meager 16%. It is often pointed out that the British introduced major infrastructure during this period, like an extensive railway network and modern telegraph lines. These systems were built with a singular focus: securing colonial control, coordinating the army, and accelerating the speed of resource extraction. The railways and ports functioned as the physical conveyor belts of the feeder economy, infrastructure engineered to drain a prosperous nation for nearly 2 centuries.